So, as I was just introduced, I'm Nikki Valens, and my pronouns are she, her, or they, them. I like to say that because I like to normalize telling people your pronouns, and I think that everybody here should also do that, even if you think it's obvious, because that's just a good practice to get into. So today I'm going to be talking about representation and diversity in games. I'm going to be focusing mostly on how we can show queer and trans characters in our games and in our industry. And that's because that's my experiences, but I want you to know that most of these lessons apply to pretty much any marginalized group that you hope to represent in your games. So like most of you, probably all of you, I'm a game designer, but probably unlike most of you, I am queer and I am trans. And that is a truth that I choose to live out loud. I like to put that in my bios. I say that on my social media because I want people to see that. I want people to see me as a professional game designer in a state of some amount of success, at least, so that they know they are welcome in this industry, that they can also make it in this industry, that they should take that as knowing that they can be part of this too, that they shouldn't be excluded. In this room, it's pretty clear that there are more straight people than there are queer people. I would bet pretty much any amount that I can count the number of trans people in this room, probably include the next room as also. We can count them on my hands. But also it's important to know that that number isn't so low because we're not interested in games or that we don't have the passion to design games and be a part of this hobby and this industry. In the same way that we and other marginalized people get pushed out of board game stores and hobby groups, we get pushed out of the industry by just the sheer lack of our representation, the discrimination and marginalization that we face. So a lot of what I want to talk about today is how we can overcome that and how we can defeat that stigma and grow our industry into a more diverse group of people. So the other week, I received a reminder that I needed to schedule an annual health checkup. So I go on to my clinic's website where I schedule these things, and it keeps track of, all of my appointments and all of my information. So they know who I am. I've gone to this clinic for some years now. And like it always does, the website reminded me that I was overdue for a pap test. For those of you that don't know, a pap test involves checking one's cervix. I don't have a cervix. I've never had a cervix. My doctor knows this. My doctor cannot affect the fact that this website continues to remind me that this thing is overdue. And this represents an assumption made on the part of the creators of this website, the runners of this clinic, that all of its clients are cisgender. The assumption that all of its clients are the default. And it is that assumption, the assumption that everyone is part of the default, that is one of the greatest challenges we have to overcome in order to show representation and diversity within the world and within our industry. So speaking here today, I know that I can't normalize this for the whole world, but I hope that it convinces all of you to take a look at the assumptions you have and to analyze where you are the default and how you can help those who aren't. I think all of you probably know how important all of this is. You're here to listen to me talk about it. But I also wanted to mention that representation in our games and in our staff, like I mentioned earlier, it helps the marginalized groups know that we are here and they are welcome too. And we can continue to grow this industry in that way. And they shouldn't be afraid to be part of it. And they shouldn't feel like they are pushed out of our communities and our industry. Representation can also help those groups feel safe within the community. And I also want to point out that when I use the word safe, I'm using that word intentionally. It's not hyperbolic. There are definitely parts of our industry where we feel unsafe and we remove ourselves from them. And that is part of what I mean by we are pushed out of the community. But that's enough about why it's important and the reasons that this is a thing that we want to focus on. So how do we do this? How do we show representation? How do we show diversity in our games? And not just any representation, but how do we show good representation? How do we avoid negative stereotypes and harmful representation? It might be pretty obvious when I say it, but I'm going to say it anyway because it needs to be said. We need to listen to and hire the people of those marginalized groups. They have the experiences that we're trying to show, and if you don't have that life experiences, it's much harder for you to show that in a real way. But I also want to say that representation shouldn't be the purpose of your game. It's not the goal of your game. Rather, representation exists naturally anywhere that there is humans or human culture. And diversity doesn't need to be about drama. It doesn't need to be dramatic to exist. It doesn't need even a reason to exist at all. The diversity is there naturally. So something I want everyone here to focus on is learn to understand when you are the default, whether that means you're cisgender or you're straight or you're white. Learn when you are the default and understand how you can not make assumptions that others are the same way that you are. And know that the representation isn't about you as the default. It's about the people that you are trying to represent. A good thing to remember is don't tell stories that aren't yours. Instead, find someone who lived that story, who has that experience. Give them the opportunity to tell that story. And if you hire consultants and sensitivity readers, and please do, listen to them, but not just that, hear them and implement the changes that they suggest. Because if you're not, you haven't really hired them. So where can we show diversity and representation in our games? And the answer is pretty much everywhere. We can show it in our art, in our text. We can show it in the rules. We can show them as playable characters. We can show them as non-playable characters. For a start, please use gender-neutral pronouns in your rulebooks. Singular they is fully accepted. If you don't like it, try using second person. It works too. Let your players customize their characters or choose from diverse options. Having a choice between male and female is certainly better than nothing, but a spectrum is even better. Many games these days strive for parity between male and female characters, but know that male and female are simply dots on that spectrum of gender, and there's so much more there. Also, don't assume your player's sexuality, or even that they are sexual to begin with. If your game has romantic or sexual story components to it, know that your players might want to represent their characters in a way that is different how you are. They might not be sexual, they might not be romantic either. Don't make them feel excluded if that is what your goal is for the game. A good example of this I have is Fog of Love. It does a lot of things right, but in the base game, it lacks options for characters that are asexual but still romantic. It seems like a pretty big failing for what that product wants to be, but it's also so easy to overlook. But beyond gender and representation, understand that players are part of, or can be part of, multiple marginalized groups, and that when that is true, their experiences are very different from the other members of those groups. So it's important to take into consideration the whole picture. So no single game designer or a single game can change this whole process, but each of us here in this room, we can begin to change people's viewpoints about how to do all of these things. This is a topic that I think it's hard to just speak to you about. I really would like to open this up for questions and discussion. Before I do that, though, there are some common questions that I've been asked quite frequently, and I'd like to address those ahead of time. One is, how do we convey a character is queer or trans? Should we label them? And I want to point out that representation is holistic. It is not any one thing. So simply labeling or inferring that a character is trans or queer is not enough. Whether you label them or not, the character is more than just that identity, and that identity will show up in more than just a label. It will show up in their style, in their story, how they react to situations, and how they interact with the world around them. How do we show representation using only art? Is another common question. So for this one, I'd like to start with some things that we shouldn't do. Don't show a masculine woman or a feminine man and just call them trans. That's not a great way to go about that. It's also just not enough to show the diversity of what being trans is about. So what can we do to show this character that won't read as them being cisgender? First, it's good to know that being queer or trans isn't just one thing. Our community is very diverse in both style and gender expression. Non-binary and gender non-conforming people exist. And if you, for example, if you were to put art of me into a game, I can guarantee you that every queer or trans person in this room at this conference, probably every queer and trans player that sees that, would be able to identify me as being queer and trans, even if those of you who are cishet cannot. And that is where the representation matters. Like me, many live out loud. We express our style visibly. We express our gender and our sexuality through our style and through loud, visible means. But that's not to say that all queer and trans folk express themselves visibly. And this leads into our next question. Is it better for representation to be obvious or go unnoticed? Is invisible representation still representation? Queer and trans people will be able to tell. It's kind of the gist of what I'm getting at here. If that representation is holistic, it will be more than those things that you might notice if you're not part of that group. We will notice things like their mannerisms, their fashion, their speaking, if they have scars or prescriptions. We'll understand those details and we'll know what that means, even if many others don't. And that is why it's also important to have those cultural consultants to hire people of the communities you want to represent to be able to do so in a holistic way. So each of these questions that I've just talked about, they share a common thread, and there's something linking them that I want to highlight. Is a label needed? Is it visible? Will anyone notice? All of these relate to the concept of passing. And I'm here to tell you that being trans or being queer, it's not about passing. It's about being who you are, being true to yourself. And I'd like to also have you take a moment to examine what the concept of passing really means. Why would queer and trans folks want to pass? Is it to be seen as normal? To be seen as the default? Is it for safety? The assumption that queer and trans folks need to or should pass is the assumption that being the default is inherently good and being anything else is inherently bad. So even in something that might seem commonplace, know that those assumptions are still there, and you should always analyze what you think to be true. There's one other common question I'd like to address before we open this up. Can we show queer or trans villains without being harmful? To which I say, if 100% of your queer and trans characters are villains, you're basically saying that 100% of queer and trans people are evil. And on a related note, can queer or trans characters be killed without falling into the bury your gays trope? Yet again, if you kill 100% of your queer and trans characters, you're probably saying that they deserve to die. So both of these have a pretty simple answer. Put more queer and trans folks in your games. It's that simple. Just show more. And also remember that we can't be reduced to just a label. The LGBT community can't be reduced to a single representative character. So I think we're about ready to open this up to discussion, and I really do want this to be a discussion. I want to hear all your questions. I want to answer them. And even if you disagree with some of the things I've said, if you just have really specific questions, I do want to hear all of that. But one other note that I want to make real quick. Cis folks, you don't need to know our gender. Knowing my gender doesn't benefit you in any way. But knowing my pronouns helps you respectfully address who I am as a person. Likewise, you don't need to label or explicitly state the gender of your characters. Having their pronouns is enough. So, who has some questions? We got one right here in the back. Do you mean if there's no story and no art?
Not necessarily if there's no art, but are there other moments or beats inside of, like when you are designing a game, where it's important to think about this, or is it just in the visuals, like in the visual part?
I think it's mostly as it relates to the characters and how they're represented. So if you're talking about specifically game mechanics that are divorced from characters or specific characters even, unless your game is about that, there's not that much correlation. But there are instances where a game could be about that. So for instance, I've done an expansion for Fog of Love that really focuses on discovering your orientation and your gender. So there, the mechanics play into that very heavily.
Can you give examples of games that are doing it right that people could turn to and look towards?
Sure. So a lot of it comes down to a lot of games have attempted to do it with art. Not many games have done it with narrative too much. I like to use Netrunner as an example of a way that art can be done well. So in part, it's because of the setting of Netrunner, because it's a cyberpunk setting. It's very unique from what we see in the modern day. People have bright, colorful hair and different hairstyles and very unique clothing styles. They express themselves very visibly. And that goes a long way in making it so that you look at every character in that setting and you go, I don't have the assumption that this character is cisgender. I don't have the assumption that this character is straight, because it's far enough style divorced from what we see on the everyday basis that that assumption starts to break down. In terms of games that do this in story very well, there aren't that many of it, and this is maybe going to seem a little self-aggrandizing, but many people have told me that Legacy of Dragonholt is actually the best example they've ever seen of using queer and trans characters in the game and representing it well. And to that, I just have to say, I've put my experiences into those characters, so thank you.
Darn open about our differences, just so that people that are in the community can be like, yes, that's somebody who won't be nasty about being trans. So if you search out these people, you can often find them pretty easily. Like, it's often in like a lot of people's usernames and it's pretty easy to track down. And I don't know if somebody's made a resource yet on all of these different people from marginalized groups, but I think the best uses I've seen in general is by people from marginalized groups where things are mentioned super casually, because like you were saying, Nikki, a lot of the things is that why people feel like there's forced diversity other than all the social aspects is because when people make it, they try to make it, yes, this character trans, pay attention to this, and it's not essential to the story. Same thing with like, yes, this character straight, it kind of feels pushed. Whereas if you mention very casually, like if you just refer to a specific character with like singular they pronouns, you never have to say that they're non-binary, but the people that know, they know. They see themselves without ever having to make anything that will raise red flags for the people that have problems with it, but the people that it's important to will get it. The more casual and normal it is, usually the better.
Yeah, you touched on something there that I do want to talk about also, which is that we seek each other out. We can find each other in the crowd, and we're drawn to each other, because it's someone who understands our experiences, and again, for that safety reason. I have a great example of this. I was walking the floor of Essen last year, and I walked up to one of the booths. There wasn't anyone there demoing the games, but it had cute Shiba Inu dogs on their game art, and I went, this is adorable. I want to sit down and play this. The person that was there to demo it walked up to me and audibly said, oh, thank goodness, another queer person. This was in just an open giant room of people, and I was the oasis for this person. That's one of the reasons representation matters. I saw a hand way back there go up.
Sort of on that note, do you have any info on support networks or resources for queer designers?
I'm sad to say there's not a whole ton of them, and there's not a whole ton of good ones either. I've heard a lot of people recommend the Rainbow BGGers groups. I'm sure there's a ton of great discords. A lot of times it's rallying around known figures within the industry. I see it a lot with video games, especially with streamers that are queer or trans. They have very inclusive communities because, like we just talked about, we're drawn to each other. I don't know that many others. If anyone does know any good groups, please let us know.
How do I respectfully seek out trans and queer artists? Like, if I'm an art director by trade, how do I respectfully ask that question? Because I know somebody was like, I definitely don't want this, and this, but I need these people. Like, I don't want to be a jerk, and I don't want to insult the people I'm trying to hire. How do I search publicly? Like, how do I search respectfully, and so that we're people on games and
So like we talked about a little bit, a lot of people put that in their public profiles. So even someone that just has put their pronouns in their profile, even if those pronouns are he or she, it's generally a pretty good tip-off that they are aware of trans issues and are an ally to trans issues at least. But also many trans artists, it's the same thing that I was talking about before of that representation being holistic. You'll be able to tell in their art. You'll see that they tend to do more characters that are of ambiguous gender, or they choose to make queer characters as whenever they have the free time to do, oh, I've made this original character that I just wanted to put up to show that it's a thing that I've made. Those will tend to lean toward that community.
To add on to that real quick, if you use especially Twitter, but social media in general, if you know of you already, if you have a post that says we're looking specifically for artists that can depict this experience accurately, they will probably repeat that. That will probably get a lot of reach, and we'll try to get that word to the right people. That's just kind of how I've seen it work. So.
Yeah, that's a very good point. If you ask for it, even if you're not directing it at specific people, we'll see it and we'll pass it along.
If, let's say you're making a game and you're on a pretty strict timeline, you've got to get all the art assets and everything put together, and then maybe one of your artists makes a mistake and misrepresents a character. What do you think? What would you do?
So I think the reason that's even a question is the idea of how important is it that this changes. So if you had graphic design or a game mechanic that simply didn't function in the game, it's pretty clear that you would fix that. You would want to halt the timeline if it needed to in order to take the time to fix that and make it better. And I would say that issues like this are on that level. If you have art that you want to portray of a marginalized person and it comes back and it's potentially harmful to them, that community, that is a serious issue. Yeah. And if that's the case, that's a call that you're going to have to make. Definitely don't put something that's harmful in the game. If it turns out that it just doesn't read as representation, how important is that representation to you? Do you really want that there? Take the time to do it.
So I'm organized with Brooksville, Minnesota. If you live near Minnesota, come to Brooksville. And so how do we have a code of conduct? You know, it's very clear we will not accept anything of harassment and then we want it to be a safe place. But how do we also get that message out and encourage people in the trans and queer community to come and know they'll be safe
say it. Just say it bluntly. Like, the only people that you're going to exclude by telling them that you won't tolerate bigotry in your organization are bigots.
Yeah, I'm happy with that. But I mean, is that enough? I mean, is there something else we can or should do?
I would say,
Not feeling safe. I would hate for someone to feel like they couldn't attend something and not feel safe somewhere.
saying it out loud is a massive step
Okay.
in making that safety be known. For instance, if I go to a game store and I see other queer and trans people there, that already makes me start to feel safer because I feel like they feel safe here. If that store also displays a trans pride flag with trans rights on it, that's a massive indication that they care and they will not tolerate discrimination. I'm gonna go right here.
At a couple of our talks, we've heard a lot about building your own personal brand.
Mm-hmm.
How have you felt about putting out queerness as part of your personal brand? Because a lot of us, I'm not super comfortable expressing a lot of my personal life on Twitter as is, and then I read that tweet about like overhearing some men on the flight talking about wanting to murder homosexuals, right?
Mm-hmm.
How has your experience been with being out?
I think it's been pretty safe for me specifically. That is not necessarily true for all. And definitely I don't think that everyone should feel like they need to come out. If you are still in a point in your life where you are passing and that's your safety net, don't let what I've said about passing indicate to you that you should lose that. I choose to live out loud because I do have the ability to do that safely, and because I choose to put others seeing me and being an inspiration to other aspiring designers above the potential risk of me being assaulted or otherwise discriminated against.
Just on a side note, I got called faggot on the street just a couple blocks away from here today. So that's fun.
Great.
Yeah, because I gave a piece of pizza to one homeless person, but not to another. Second thing, I am going to be playtesting a queer storytelling game over there tonight. If anyone wants to play a super gay game, and then. And the third thing is, so somebody asked about like good examples in games.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a little bit sort of more sparse, but what about other media like, novels or TV shows or movies or, comics where you think that they've done it really wrong?
I mean, I'm going to say Steven Universe first because I'm wearing a Steven Universe shirt and I was wearing one yesterday as well. That is a show that definitely made me feel seen and acknowledged in a mediascape that generally doesn't do that. In terms of comics and story writing, a few months ago, I would have said Magic the Gathering was doing a pretty good job, but lately they've really dropped the ball on that. Yeah, they've done some pretty good things showing queer and trans characters, showing them in really genuine ways. Though recently, one of the books they put out basically invalidated 3 years of slow burn buildup between two female characters. In a very ham-fisted way. It was clear that someone is working against the gay agenda.
So I teach middle school, and my Gay Straight Alliance is meeting right now. They were so excited to hear that I was listening to a queer game designer. They wanted me to tell you hello, and like one of my students just chose their new name, and so these are middle school, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, and I have a lot of them. I have like 20, 30 kids that come
And so, and I do changes on them every day the kid that I have, you know, so like the kids are coming and change is coming. And so the more we do now to create that space, like the foundation is being built so that we can make this community as widely open and accepting as it needs to be. It's, you know, for them, it's just who they are. It's not so much coming out, it's more like coming into their own acceptance. And it's such a beautiful change that I see for a lot of them. So I just want to let you know that you're going to be back.
Great.
That's why, like, Nikki and myself, and I'm more like, usually we show ourselves the way we do is because, like you were saying, even though there's like an inherent general risk at discrimination, bigotry, hatred, and just straight up danger, it paves the way for those kids to just be like, oh, yeah, this is just a casual part of who I am.
Mm-hmm.
Laying the groundwork for that. And if you want to find, I do want to say there is a clear version of the normal test it is, but basically like the how to evaluate it. Right, so you're the best, yeah. There's a clear version of that, and it's also for websites where it's anything and everything that we found and that we're like, oh, this is a good book, this is a good comic, these are good movies and shows, or like video games that really portray trans experience as well. If you want to like understand and be a part of that concept. So if you look for it, you can find it.
Mm-hmm. Green shirt back.
So I can think of ways like testing in co-design to try to be more kind of culturally relevant.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other culture consultants that you'd recommend for designers to make sure their games are expressing more stories of their own?
I can't remember any of the names off the top, but similarly with the question of how can I find artists that can portray these, if you make a call on social media, Twitter is usually very good about that. Also, I do that work as well, and I can help you find people that do that work.
Sort of as a follow-up compliment to that, for a particular design, I'm looking both for you sort of like in-depth, paid cultural consultants, but I also want to open up. I'm happy to hear from everyone in these particular communities, but at the same time, like 500 people tell me things, and I can't afford to pay a cultural consultant against 500 people. Any suggestions for how to present that in a way which is respectful and solicitous of, I would like to hear anything you want to tell me without being, but at the same time, I don't want to imply, like, what I would like to take your time is valuable.
Yep.
Still acknowledging value.
I think it is a difficult thing to do for sure. Putting the question out there in itself isn't bad. One thing is to make sure is that when you do it, you express that like you're respectful of their time. You know that you do not deserve their emotional labor, that if they are giving it to you for free, that is greatly respected and a choice that they're making. But also try to pay them anything that you can. Like take them to dinner, give them a copy of the game if that's something that you can easily afford. If it's not a contract that you can sign for them, give them something at least. Just try to compensate the time that they give you.
I just wanted to add on to a couple things that were going around, which is the protocol question, for example. If you're running an event, if you have like stickers that turn out on it, or if you can make a bunch of things that people have and have everyone, like whether they're sort of trans or whatever, wear one is a good way
Yep.
to be welcoming. I don't know how many of y'all have an interest in like tabletop RPGs, but I'm kind of in this group of queer trans tabletop designers for RPGs specifically, and I'd love to talk about that if any of y'all want to find me later. And about the consultant thing, if you want, I would say at least make sure you hire two. Never hire this one.
Yep.
Always hire at least two people from any group that you are looking to consult from. And then after that, you should be, you have done your due diligence and hire at least two people at the very least.
Yep. I want to repeat both of those points. when you are hiring sensitivity readers and cultural consultants, do hire more than one, because no single person has all of the experiences within that community. And then also, many of you have noticed that I do have my pronouns on this Fog of Love card that I made for myself. I request that next year this conference has pronoun labels available, and it's recommended that everyone use them, even if they think that their pronouns are obvious.
Just to add to the consultation, like Nikki was saying, if you make it clear that you're just like, hey, obviously you don't have to do this, but if you have the time, you'd be willing just to sit down and talk about like your life story, your experiences, so that I can better understand this going forward. Even if you make it clear that it's not like a paid gig and you can't offer anything, there are lots of trans people that would happily spend 15, 20 minutes to like an hour and a half just talking to ensure that somebody gets that community more.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen lots of people go like, hey, share your experiences, and like I can add your name to like list of consultants or like people that contributed to the information used in this.
Yep.
Anything and everything to get people involved.
And ultimately, like, if you can't compensate them in any way and there is no one willing to give you that emotional labor for free, that's just one of those situations where that's not your story to tell. And you'll just have to either find a way to pay them or let it go.
I wanted to speak to setting up events or getting, trying to get more involvement. The question here earlier. One of the things I found, I used to try to educate people. I used to try to change people's minds, right? Gaming is our release. It's not what to do that. When I set up playtest now, when I set up meetups, when I have game nights, I specifically say in the invite and multiple places that this is a trans queer friendly space, like it is a safe space. And all that is done is made by the hospital, and people get one time to mess up permanently. If they do it more than once, it's just disrespect. And that's it. And it's worked. We've got a really diverse group, and it's gone fantastic. I've never had to kick anybody out for screwing up pronouns, and I absolutely will. But that's the other thing, you have to be willing to enforce it. You cannot call something a safe space and it's not safe. Period.
Cool. Anything else that anyone wants to say, or really specific questions maybe?
You've already addressed a couple of these issues, but I was wondering how cishet people can make people feel safe and respected without being performed.
So it's going to come back to pronouns again. One of the easiest things you can do is put your pronouns in your public profile. Like, if I see a cishet person, their profile has those, I know that they're at least knowledgeable of that and understand a reason to do that. But it's understanding a lot of the nuances that you probably wouldn't have known about if you don't hear our stories. So knowing queer and trans people and hearing their stories, hearing the bad things that they've gone through or the challenges that they face, you'll become more knowledgeable of the things that they might be worrying about and how to negate those worries and make them feel safe. Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you for listening. Hopefully I didn't sound too preachy. I think it's a pretty important topic, so I'm glad you all took the opportunity to listen to me. Okay, we got one more right there, and then we're done.
When they're in danger, she picks up and defends this person specifically by choice. It's not passive, it's not like any person in the street. Picking up a sword and put life in danger for another person to make sure they don't die because you care is another way to prove you love someone and back up with action. You can go beyond the labels. You don't even need the labels. You're just showing one character, holding them with another, backing up their expression of care with actions, the way you bridge the gap in their command. Point out designers focusing actions instead of the labels or haircut, things
That's a great comment. Thank you. All right, I think that's all the time we have. There's people outside waiting to use the room. All right, thank you.